And I just want to formally confirm that it is in fact live. Okay, so thank you to everybody joining tonight. My name is Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee at Progressive Massachusetts. Today is Earth Day. I am wearing one of my favorite shirts, my Oscar the Grouch smiling in a recycling bin t-shirt, because recycling, of course, being much better than trash. It's also apparently designed by Laura Crepon, a nice 70s connection for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. To celebrate Earth Day, I thought it would be great to be able to talk about issues around environmental justice, and especially connected in, as many of these live streams have, to the ongoing pandemic and how environmental justice and public health are such intertwined issues. So to discuss that this evening, I have Vick Mohanka from Clean Water Action. Vick, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about what Clean Water Action does?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for the introduction. As John said, my name is Vick Mohanka. I'm the Clean Energy Organizer at the Clean Water Action Boston office. So we're a nationwide organization, and our bottom line is community health. So we were founded out of the Clean Water Act and needing stronger enforcement of it around the US. And we've expanded in each state. You know, we kind of address relevant issues that each individual state office is dealing with. In Massachusetts, our programs are focused on getting toxic products off of the shelves and out of our homes. We are also focused on cleaning up lead in people's waters, specifically replacing lead service line in environmental justice communities. And a large part of my job is working on enhancing our clean energy policies and Massachusetts' commitment to climate justice.
Awesome. So before this, we were talking a little bit about the kind of, as you kind of indicated there, the links with environmental justice and public health. So earlier today, I was reading an article that quoted an official from the World Health Organization, noting that in countries and cities and areas with high air pollution, that those places are especially at risk for let's say, for fatal cases of COVID-19. So that kind of air pollution exacerbating that current pandemic. Can you tell people a little bit about why that is? Like, what is the connection between kind of higher levels of air pollution and kind of a higher fatality rate?
Yeah, sure. And I'll start by saying I'm not a medical doctor or some sort of scientist. So I don't have a biology lesson, but we can glean a lot from the social science behind it. So we know that there's like co-determinants of health, and we know that in communities of color and low-income communities around the U.S., Massachusetts, around the world, really. The less resources that people have, the less healthily you're able to live. And you see that especially, it's the most concentrated where there's the most population density. So when we talk about inner cities, there's multiple, like a confluence of factors that have added up over the history of the way that we've developed those cities. And you really have to get into like the political, economic, and social justice to kind of see the way that people are kind of ignored or given, a worse environment to live in by the systems we live in. So one example that we point to a lot are transportation emissions. So if you look at how we designed highways, where they were built, and then the communities that are next to them, some of the highest levels of air pollution in Massachusetts are, Chinatown in Boston, or Dorchester right next to the I-93 corridor. So these are communities that were changed greatly to build those highways. And then after they were built, there's low property values and you ended up with lower income communities. And that also is strongly correlated with having, minority populations.
And then one kind of, to bring it even more direct level, one of the kind of the outcomes of this is that you do have in a number of areas that are kind of lower income, disadvantaged communities, higher rates of like already existing with the respiratory diseases or pre-existing conditions, and that those kind of exacerbate the situation of somebody who does get sick.
Yeah, so something that we talk about a lot is a ranking put out by the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America. So they look at the 20 hardest cities to live in the U.S. with asthma. So it's a combination of the rate of asthma, the rate of hospitalization from asthma-related issues, and then the availability and quality of treatment, including the preventative treatment as well. And in Massachusetts, we have 3 of the top asthma capitals of the USA. So in the whole country, we have 3 of the worst cities to live in, and that's Boston, Springfield, and Worcester. And, you know, another note is that those also have extremely large populations of color in those cities. And, you know, we're talking about a lot of urban density, people living in buildings that aren't up to code, living next to trash incinerators. You're talking about highways, different types of energy generation. You're also talking about, when you're talking about inner cities, you're sitting on top of the oldest natural or fracked gas distribution systems in the whole nation. You know, natural gas used to get around town in wooden pipes. And then we switched from wood to cast iron, you know, something like 100 years ago. And then a lot of that is still there from 100 years ago. So, you know, we're completely like under us, there's another world of,
Yeah.
and it's all of those emissions are leaking up and we're breathing those.
Yeah, because as you know that, because as you're saying that you end up seeing the compounding of that inequality because the people, because of the situations where they live, are more likely to develop kind of respiratory diseases like asthma or other causes. That puts them at high, like when you have a respiratory related kind of pandemic disease going along, they're more likely to die from that, as well as, I think one thing we were talking about before this about the triage issue that compounds those inequalities in hospitals. You want to just quickly?
Yeah, so I don't know the specifics of the hospital policies, but we've been hearing about a triage policy that would give respirators and you know, limited care, like the limited resources we have, to the patients that have the highest chance of recovery. So those are, you know, disproportionately people without pre-existing conditions. And we know that pre-existing conditions are things that disproportionately affect communities of color. So I think, you know, COVID put this into like really stark terms because it's affecting everyone. But a lot of the communities that we're talking about are communities that have been in crisis, that have had public health crises for decades. When you look at the poorest neighborhoods in Massachusetts and the richest ones, you're talking about over a 10-year life expectancy difference. It is almost unbelievable. Like you're talking, like that's the difference between on average living from 60 to 70. That's a really stark difference that people, and there's, you know, public health professionals talk about this all the time, but there's all sorts of racial disparities in maternal mortality, and then like all different health issues are affected. And even after you control for income, you see those effects there based on race. So all of the things that we're talking about, it's hitting like Black and Latinx communities the hardest, and it has been hitting them the hardest for decades. It's nothing new.
Yeah, so like it reminds me as well is that, so like in Massachusetts, and I think in general, there are designations of certain cities as like environmental justice communities based on say, like the demographics, racial demographics, income demographics, etc., as well as kind of the historical siting of pollution sites in disadvantaged. I'm messing with the definition.
Oh yeah, so the definition. All right, yeah, let's get into it a little bit.
Yeah, what is an environmental justice community?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, the environmental justice communities have a specific definition designed, you know, 20 years ago or a little bit more than that, and it was originally a policy, and then it became an executive order. So we still don't have this in statute. There's no statutory like binding laws behind this. So in the executive order, there's 3 ways to qualify as an environmental justice community. And you're right, one was racial makeup. So I think it's if you're over 25% minority. And then one is based on income. So if the average income is not lower than 50% of the state median, there's a different threshold, but it's based on income. And then the third one is based on language isolation. And so that's the number of people who don't speak English in a given area. And the reason that that was created that way is because with those 3 definitions, those served as proxies for being able to kind of like catch the areas that had the least amount of political and economic power. And those also happen to be areas, if you don't have political power, then you end up dealing with environmental justice issues. When a company is looking where to put something that could go in any town, they're going to choose the easiest place to put it, the place with the least amount of political and economic resources. So that definition, it's more expansive, and it doesn't take into account, actual environmental burdens, because the idea was we want to make a definition that would catch everyone who could be considered an environmental justice community. And the benefit of that, of being over-inclusive, is that when you are actually going through the siting process, when you want to build something polluting, then if there's an extra level of attention because of an environmental justice community, you would want that to happen as much as possible.
So like to that point of the extra attention, what tangibly comes with that designation for a municipality?
Yeah, right. So I will say it's not on the municipality level, it's on a community level.
Okay,
so
kind
a
of
lot of municipalities
as well.
Right. So and right now almost nothing comes with it. Basically it's like it's a EJ, environmental justice EJ designation in name only.
Okay.
That's what we're working on changing. So we have a couple bills. The consensus one is H4264. It's a environmental justice legislation. Basically, it codifies what's in the executive order. And then once we have that in the statutes, we can use it to base other statutes on it, and then also hopefully use it in lawsuits. Because right now, environmental justice, the concept of it, doesn't exist in Massachusetts laws.
Okay, so it's just something that is kind of helpful for communities organizing against something or bringing greater awareness to things, but lacks that kind of almost like enforceability that building it into statute would have.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the issue is the accountability. What are our the energy developers, what are they accountable to? What pressures are the governor, his administration accountable to? And when you look at the Department of Public Utilities, you look at the decisions that are being made on our energy system that are disproportionately affecting environmental justice communities. They're being made with impunity. They just, they can do what they want and no one's paying attention. I mean, how many, not that I expect, anyone in the audience to have heard of any of this, but like, how many of you have heard of a decision made by the Department of Public Utilities, right? It's not something we talk about. It's not something the news reports. It's not something that's part of the public conversation. And that means that they get to get away with whatever they want.
And then on the issue of environmental justice communities, one thing that I was wondering is that, are we seeing like a higher level of, let's say, of impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic in the neighborhoods or cities that are designated environmental justice communities?
Yeah, definitely. There's a huge correlation. Every low-income community and community of color is designated right now on the map. So, we've been hearing stories about Chelsea, which has the highest rates of COVID-19 infections. And that is one of the ground zeros of the environmental justice movement in Massachusetts. So we've been working with Chelsea Green Roots, an organization there, for years. And one thing we've been working to do is fight against a substation project that is they completely ignored public input. It was supposed to be on land that was promised to the community to be used for the community good. And there's no climate change plan for extreme weather events. There's all sorts of issues with the siting of it. And, Chelsea is a really interesting example of an environmental justice community because basically it holds all the infrastructure that lets Boston be Boston. And it's if you look at the people.
Here's some examples of it.
Oh, like all the salt and jet fuel for Boston is in Chelsea.
Oh wow.
So all of the infrastructure, like the stuff that you need to make Boston to keep it going is in Chelsea. And Chelsea is, a low income area. It's got high immigrant population. The people who are benefiting most from that infrastructure aren't, paying the cost of living next to it.
Yeah. And are there any other kind of thing you would say, what are the other kind of major environmental justice communities that Clean Water Action is doing work in? Or how many are there, and how many cities or neighborhoods do you have that designation, if you know off the top of your head?
I do not know off the top of my head. Some of it is a little bit a little bit of exercise in like data analysis and stuff. I guess some of the main places that we work in, we do a lot of statewide work. So I live in Worcester, so I'm trying to join a lot of the efforts in Worcester. We have an office in Northampton, so we also try to support work that's going on in Springfield and Holyoke. Really, we have a lot of allies. Like Clean Water Action is not a frontline organization. So if there's one thing that people could take away from this, it's go learn more about frontline organizations and support them. Support us too. Like we support frontline organizations, but it's really key to know who's close to you and who's working with the most vulnerable populations. So I already called out Green Roots in Chelsea. One really great group we work with is Neighbor to Neighbor, and they have chapters in Lynn, Worcester, Springfield, and Holyoke. We also work with the Coalition for Social Justice in Brockton, Fall River. Basically, every gateway city is also has a ton of environmental justice issues.
And then was it good on that front? So what are some of the main things of people living in those cities? What are the main things that end up causing, let's say, the public health problems for people who live there? What about the ways you spoke to us a little bit earlier about how those cities are designed, kind of most exacerbate that, whether talking even about, let's say, the public air or even in people's own homes?
Yeah. So I would just say it's a combination of everything. The fact that we have, fracked gas running under every single building, the fact that people aren't able to afford rent, and that means that they're more desperate when it comes to where they're living. They aren't able to, have a place to live where they're secure, where they feel like they could, talk to their landlord about the molds in their house, something like that. That's a huge issue. Proximity to highways is a very big pollutant. We've seen studies that show that some of the bigger the particles, the less far they travel, but some of the smaller particles from highways, those are traveling hundreds of meters away from the highway. So, an example of I-93 in Boston, which is basically a parking lot for 6 hours a day, that all of that particulate matter is basically just flowing into Dorchester. Yeah. So even there's a famous case with Dudley Square and the bus terminal. So even when you have public transit and everyone's taking public transit, if you have, giant engines, like diesel engines or just regular gas engines that are running, 16 hours a day or whatever they were doing, those are going to cause a massive amount of pollution.
Yeah, so on that point, thinking of how transportation emissions end up exacerbating this a lot, what are some of the ways that we could reduce transportation emissions in Massachusetts?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of policies, a lot of policy proposals that are out there right now. So the governor has proposed I think it's $18 billion transportation bond bill, and we're also our state is poised to join the Transportation Climate Initiative, which would basically be a fee on gas or fuel entering the state, and then we would use that for investments in our system. And I think the most important thing about transportation is that people need to have alternatives. So, I live 10 minutes away from our our commuter rail station in Worcester. And I have a choice between taking the commuter rail or the car to work every day. Most people who live in Massachusetts don't have that choice. So when we talk about transportation, the biggest thing that we need is a massive amount of infrastructure to be built so that people don't have to sit alone in their car and drive to work. I think that's one of the biggest things. And then if we want to talk about specifically what's going to reduce the most emissions in environmental justice communities, it's a little different because honestly, if you look on the highway, and they did a study on this for congestion pricing, which means higher tolls during rush hour. If they did congestion pricing on Mass Pike, 2% of those drivers would be low income. So that means 98% of the people who are on the road in rush hour can afford to pay more. That is not representative of Massachusetts. So there's a huge inequity here where, upper income people have 2 cars per household. Lower income people have probably less than 1 on average. And if we want to, make things better, we have to kind of hit multiple things at once. So we have to get people out of their cars. And then to deliver some of the biggest benefits to EJ communities, we're talking about most likely things like electric buses, especially school buses. So our particulates, young people are much more vulnerable to particulate matter. So when you have like 50 school buses idling outside of a school for half an hour, that's just creating a huge plume of invisible pollutants that all of those kids are breathing in. So there's a combination of those public investments that are specifically targeted, and then things that just give people more options in general.
How does, out of curiosity, like how does Massachusetts stand relative to other states when it comes to decarbonizing our transportation system? Are there any states doing a good job of this? Like we always hear about, like, I know many other countries are doing a great job, but just curious if any states are actually like doing really forward thinking stuff on transportation.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not like super well versed in that. I think part of it. So the flip side of transportation is that the way that we've set up our suburbs are kind of guaranteeing there's some locked in like last mile car emissions. So even if you have a commuter rail station, you're driving to it alone in your car. And I think that's true all over America. And places where you have urban density, you have cleaner transportation systems. And in places with big suburbs and exurbs and giant sprawl, there's no choice other than to drive. So, we want to make better choices for people, but part of that is, transportation means getting people where they need to go. And we need to make it so people need to go less far.
Yeah,
In addition.
So basically, so that you have density and that you have so you have affordable places to live that are not sprawling and far away from each other, which the development of our state really has it. Like some places where I live is very dense and like very accessible, but that's a rarity for most of the state, especially once you get kind of in exurban areas where there's just no public transit infrastructure to speak of. So that even if you wanted to not be reliant on a car, it would still be difficult. And that, as you're noting, that you would still have to drive a certain distance to even get to the public transit to get you into the city. And then you have the time differentials between those. So making sure that you do have a public transit system that is cheap or even free, and that runs frequently, and that covers as much territory as possible.
Yeah, and I also I don't want to point this as something that is like so chicken and egg, like which one do we do first, that we can't crack it, because we live in a country that had a massive disinvestment in public transit.
Mhm.
So, you know, if you look at my city that I live in, Worcester, we used to have a tram. We used to have public transit in the
Yeah.
city. You know, there were ways to get around before cars, but now it's your choices are a bus system that only goes to like one place. You have to go to, you know, the center of the town if you want to use the buses, or you have to have a car or a bike. And it's like we have the history of this, and we kind of need to relearn some of the lessons from history
Yeah.
that like we had great systems.
What out of curiosity, like, can you speak to like what happened to them? Like, what led to, let's say, do you know why Worcester kind of eliminated that, or other cities moved away from when they did have if they did have a greater public infrastructure in the past?
Yeah, it's a little bit before my time, you know, like the 50s era, car culture, but
Yeah.
it all came out of that, like the car culture, the National Highway Lobby, and the car manufacturers kind of pushing their mode of transportation as the American way.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think I'm very hopeful that like millennials and the next generation seem to have a different value set than, you know, this like nuclear family, you know, 2 cars drive to work. It feels like the new generation of Americans is not seeing that as the only way to live.
Yeah, and there have been, I think, statistics showing like lower, both probably for cultural as well as possibly economic reasons, lower car ownership rates among younger people, as well as an increasing tendency of millennials to move back into the cities that do have kind of that tend to be denser and having stronger public transit infrastructure as well.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some reverse white flight in our cities. It's
Mhm.
really interesting. It's really interesting to compound that and some of the environmental benefits of that to the like negative environmental justice consequences of it and gentrification. Um,
Yeah,
so, so I think part of it is like this. It's like an affordability crisis that's being felt by multiple like discrete populations. So you have those young people who feel like they want to be in the cities but can't afford, like even if they didn't want to be in the city, you can't really afford to buy a house when you're 23, you
hmm
know. And then that population is kicking out the population of people who are there, like largely service workers, communities of color, immigrants, who end up moving out to kind of further suburbs and then depending more on the transportation system to get back into the city. So,
yeah.
yeah, we're kind of it's just like a giant like shuffling game in the world of economics. It's all like transfers, and we're not actually
Mhm.
benefiting from this. So what we would like to see is a return to the you know, massive investments in the public good.
Yeah, and think when you were talking about the thinking about, I mentioned the 50s. I was talking about, let's say, the 1970s earlier, because we have hit like the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And I was thinking of the 1970s and how like the late 60s and early 70s, you saw this wave of federal environmental policy making. And then the recent history hasn't been great on that front. There are some advances, typically by executive order under Obama, but when it comes to, let's say, actual environmental like legislating,
Hmm.
there aren't that many good recent examples. Can you speak to what's happened in those 50 years? Like, sure, 50 years since.
Yeah. So I think on the federal level and on the state level, we see a similar dynamic. Um, and you know, clean water action is nonpartisan. I'll start with that. But I think if you look purely historically and not in a
Yeah.
prescriptive way, um, what you see is that
You can speak to conservative versus liberal or progressive, which are not
right.
inherently aligned with parties in given cases.
Yeah, and I think so. There was a concerted effort by conservatives and conservative institutions to basically make sure there's no progress on environment. There was a false dichotomy that says that to do things that are good for the environment, then we have to do things that are bad for the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fundamentally the like falsehood that keeps pushing forward all the like false narratives and specious arguments. And so what happened on the federal level and the state level is the same, but the difference is that on the state level, instead of being caught up in gridlock because Congress is split
Mm-hmm.
between conservative and liberal / progressives,
Mm-hmm.
you see a lot more variance and control. So you can see places that were completely controlled by conservatives, places completely controlled by, liberals, and some places in between. In the states where there were more liberal politicians and policies, you actually saw faster economic growth,
Mm-hmm.
from renewable energy policies, which is really interesting. You see states filling in the gaps. You see states like California basically make standards that are nationally adopted, and other states can opt into those standards to be on a higher than federal level. You saw that with car emissions, for example, where states wanted to go above and beyond what the federal government required. So I think it's really interesting to kind of look at it on a state by state level, look at who controlled the state houses and what kinds of policies came out. And then if you overlay that with which states had the most economic growth, you see a narrative fall apart very quickly, because the states that have the most investments in, green infrastructure and the green economy, they're growing so much faster.
Yeah.
We're growing faster. Massachusetts is one of them.
Yeah. No, it reminds me of some of like that false that reassertion of a specific image of what the economy is against things that are like good for the public. Reminds me of some of the discourse we're seeing right now. Granted, like the economy does need to be on pause now, like for like public health reasons. But the kind of discourse about kind of reopening the economy, public health be damned, and that kind of seeing the like a kind of a reification of the economy as something that cannot coexist with public health. Just kind of a long-standing framing when like in fact the best thing for, let's say, the long-term economy is to do things that are good for public health, to avoid disaster long term.
Yeah.
Like short term.
And I was like an economics major in college, so I don't want to get super deep into this versus environmental justice issues. But it's true. It's how we define our economic growth. And if we define it by GDP, then we're talking about protecting private investments. And I can tie this back. So in the world of climate action, what we see from conservative forces is that instead of wanting to do action that would mitigate the costs and the risks of climate change, what they would rather do is figure out ways to minimize the hurt from climate change on private investments. So basically, we're talking about protecting developers' properties and things like that, instead of how do we reduce those emissions in the first place so we don't end up with this issue. Another environmental justice example of that is the Weymouth Compressor Station, and the complete silence and inaction from the Baker administration on it. So
just take one step back.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what is the whole issue with the Weymouth Compressor Station.
Yeah, so all right, like climate change is happening. We need to is that too far back? No. We need to so part of what we need to do to stop climate change is stop emitting fossil fuels. Part of stopping emitting fossil fuels is not to keep building expansions to the distribution systems for fossil fuels. So the Weymouth Compressor Station,
a lock-in effect.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of like legal aspects to it where, the ratepayer, so on your bill, you have to pay for resources, even if, those are no longer things that we want. So there's stranded assets that we still pay for on our bills. So right now the Weymouth Compressor Station, we're fighting against a future stranded asset. So this is a station that would increase the pressure in the pipelines, and that's either to export north to Maine or export to another country. And basically both utility companies, the large utility companies in Massachusetts, National Grid and Eversource, they both said they don't want this expansion. So the Weymouth compressor station has been a long time fight for local and state activists. Right now, it basically got the final permits and it's being constructed by the Baker administration. And kind of tying it back to that whole economic argument of it. So another fact that's relevant is that the compressor stations in general are basically massive diesel engines. It's like an engine as big as an apartment. And basically, when you're running an engine on some sort of fossil fuel, you're going to get all sorts of toxic and volatile chemicals in the atmosphere. It's in the air that we're breathing. It doesn't just like go up and out. It's on our level, depending on what the wind is like. Especially the Weymouth one is, on the ocean, that could blow right into the town. If they have some sort of large emission event. And those chemicals that will be emitted by this station have been proven to be linked to things like brain cancer and respiratory illness. So tying this all back, like activists have been fighting this station for years. There's been legal fights. The town of Weymouth is in support of stopping it. Our senators are against it. Like every politician except the Baker administration is against this compressor station.
So is there like a permitting? So if the town itself is against it, how are they able to build there? Is there like does the Baker administration on the state level have the ability to like permit above the level that the city has?
Yeah, so we have something called the Energy Facility Siting Board, which is a one-stop shop so that large companies, mostly out-of-state companies, can come and build their infrastructure. So that siting board kind of is that permitting process. It completely ignores community input. They were able to completely override what the town wanted because, in their argument, it is essential energy infrastructure, even though the utility companies said they don't need it to serve Massachusetts residents. So yeah, we're in a situation where the Baker administration is permitting and completely silent on the emissions from a compressor station that's going to cause brain cancer. And what you see is like it's much more palatable to the conservative like ideology and practice to talk about like helping people that already have brain cancer than to make the public investments in the first place so that we're lowering the risk for people.
Although often they don't even care about helping us this is either. So one thing that this reminded me of, as you have this site that will be creating large levels of pollution for people who live near there, reminded me of that there's one term in a lot of kind of environmental justice rhetoric about like sacrifice zones. Tell us, like, what does that term mean?
Yeah, so it's the idea that, I guess it's like, if you're going to have something that is emitting, then, you might as well put it in a place where it's the easiest to put it. So yeah. we kind of talked about this earlier. The communities that have the least amount of economic and political power, those end up being sacrifice zones. I hear this term used a lot when we talk about indigenous land. We talk about federal eminent domain and using land that was promised by the US in treaties for things like pipelines, ignoring, tribal consent, things like that. And it's one of the biggest red flags that we have right now around the current language around net zero goals. So the Baker administration released an Earth Day announcement saying that they want to commit to net zero emissions. So what we had before was a reduction of our 1990 level of emissions by 80%. which would leave 20% of those emissions still allowable by 2050. And the Baker administration basically said, excuse me, we want that to be slightly lower. And for all those emissions that are left, we're going to put in offsets, which fixes the environmental issue. Offset meaning like planting trees. So the carbon that's positive is offset by the carbon that's negative going back into the ground. When you end up doing that, you know, whether it's a conscious decision or a decision made by the way that our economic system works, those emissions are going to be put somewhere, and they're going to be put in environmental justice communities. Something I I say a lot is that, like, they're not building compressor stations in Swampscott.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's so ridiculous when you look at the communities where they build infrastructure. It's always working class communities, lower income communities.
And I think that that's an excellent point, that when we think about, let's say, like net zero, that means that there will still be pollution and offset, but that's not going to happen in the same place. And even if from like a macro level of emissions analysis, they balance each other out, on the micro level of that specific city, town, or neighborhood, you are still going to be heavily polluting areas.
Exactly. And that's why it's really important that we have environmental justice in our laws. Like, we need this to be enforceable. We need it to be to have some structure in our government, and we need to follow through on implementation. So right now, if we followed all the laws in the Constitution that we have, we actually wouldn't have a massive environmental justice problem. The issue is the implementation in our communities is lackluster. It's completely like devoid of any morals, and it's kind of dependent on like arcane and obtuse budgeting processes. And you know, I'll give you an example of something that so we were fighting for Office of Health Equity and then a Director of Environmental Justice in the Massachusetts state budget. So we ended up winning that fight 2 years ago in 2018. We got it written into the budget. So then there's a dedicated pool of money for those. In addition to that position, that office had to do a study on the levels of emissions and how those are specifically affecting communities of color. This would be the first report by our state government that looked at environmental justice, specifically on racial, along racial lines. And that was a state law. It was written into the budget. I've asked the administration about it for 2 years, and they're still working on it. The first one was due, I think, in February of 2019. So I'm still waiting for that. The report was passed, the requirement was passed twice, and they haven't done it yet. So even when we win things, the government can still just not do it. And what are the consequences? You know, Baker doesn't like leave office or lose money. So there's basically no consequences for our government not implementing and enforcing the laws that we have.
And so just going forward to the idea of, so if we want to actually get ourselves like beyond just, let's say, like of a net zero that leaves a lot of pollution still happening, but like seriously bringing emissions down, what are some of the things that Massachusetts could be doing to like ramp up renewable energy in the state?
Yeah, so there's two forms of renewable energy that we can put almost anywhere. That's solar and wind. For hydroelectricity, we can't put it anywhere. You're dependent on geography and geology. Same with geothermal energy. It's dependent on what you're sitting on, basically. So for offshore wind, we've done a really good job of putting together a massive competitive procurement program. It's one of the biggest ones in the nation. We were one of the first ones to get on it, which means that we're getting international investment in that infrastructure in the supply chain in Massachusetts. That's really good. And then there's onshore wind and solar, which we're lagging behind on massively. For onshore wind, kind of the issue was that basically it's just really hard to cite it. There was a bill in the legislature a couple of years ago, wind energy siting reform, and it failed in the 11th hour, and nobody has wanted to touch it since because, you know, if it failed, that means it's a bad idea, right? So that's kind of an issue. Basically, our onshore wind comes a lot from Maine. So like you said, we put it somewhere else, and then we count those benefits ourselves. Those aren't Massachusetts jobs. That's not physically created here. And the last policy, solar, has been, in my mind, even more egregious because the state put an artificial cap on how much solar could be built. It was the net metering cap. And that was illegal, that was a statutory limit, meaning that every time you wanted to build more solar energy, you had to ask the legislature to pass a bill to increase it. Thankfully, in 2016, that changed. When they changed it, they also cut the incentive for solar energy by 40%. So that cut right there lost thousands of jobs in the solar industry. We drastically decreased how much our solar economy was growing. And that also meant that the types of projects that could help low-income communities were literally made impossible. One of my colleagues, Mariama White-Hammond, had a project ready to go. She was part of the church, and they had a project ready to go in the church, and they completely had to change the project and downsize it because of that law. And we're still recovering. We haven't recovered those jobs yet. And basically, like, since there was a massive job loss, we know that there's thousands of jobs in growing solar energy. You can put it anywhere. It can go on anyone's roof. You can find space for it. You know, you could put it on brownfields. That's things like landfills. You can put it on parking lots. So canopy solar has a ton of other benefits. You can even put it on farms. Our agricultural solar programs are really successful in the state when there's enough space to make them.
Mm-hmm. Are there any good pieces of legislation that you'd highlight about trying to help expand both, let's say, like solar in general, and especially the equity angle of solar that you were pointing to?
Yeah, so one coalition that I work with a lot, the Green Justice Coalition, we are working on a suite of solar energy policies. This gets kind of in the weeds. Basically, the idea is that we want to make a solar policy that would allow low-income people to directly save on their energy bill without any sort of contract. So basically, for low-income people, this would be free money off of their electric bill. And these projects exist. It's called Low-Income Community Shared Solar. So yeah, it's a bit of a name. And so we've had incentives for them for at least like 10 years. And those incentives have been kind of weird and hard to navigate. And the newest ones are very difficult to navigate. And it's resulted in a slew of issues. So we're definitely supporting legislation from Representative Dykema, and it's filed in the Senate with Senator Eldridge on low-income solar, as well as the Senate Next Generation Climate Policy. It has one of our main policy provisions in it, which is a carve out for low-income solar. And thankfully, the Department of Energy regulation also put out a new policy with a solar carve out. And we're currently going through those new regulations to try to see where the gaps might be. We've heard from the industry that it's still not going to be enough to actually get these projects off the ground. Something that we see a lot with when you're talking about bringing resources to environmental justice communities, especially things like solar, where you're asking private developers to put those resources in, is that they're going to go for the cheapest and easiest thing they can do. Mm-hmm. And for them, that's going to, you know, a grassy fields on the side of I-90 instead of, you know, creating contracts with 200 low-income people in Roxbury. That's just a lot of extra costs, a lot of effort. So our state government needs to take that into account and weigh the social benefits.
Definitely, yeah. And then, so what do you see as the likelihood of that the Massachusetts legislature will actually take some good climate action this session? Because one of the things that I've been thinking about is if the 4 years of the Trump presidency were to end, and hopefully there only 4 years, and Massachusetts doesn't really do anything like major in climate change. That just feels like an embarrassment for the state. So like, do you see movement in the legislature on climate legislation?
We do see movement. There's a lot of bills right now. The House has one called Greenworks. The Senate's one that I just mentioned, the Next Generation Climate Policy, is moving. Um, and we're also seeing some transportation policy that's pretty hopeful. I think I'm relatively confident that we're going to see some sort of climate policy. I think some of the hesitancy from the environmental justice community is that a lot of these climate policies are talking about investments, and they're very they're lax on the details. So when you just say there's a $1 billion program, you don't specify where it's going, the assumption is that it's going to go where resources have gone before, and that largely skips over environmental justice communities. We've seen that with the Mass Save program. It's a nation-leading energy efficiency program. We spend almost $1 billion a year on it on your electric bill. It's hidden. It's not the energy efficiency cost that you actually see on there. And it's done an okay job at reaching the lowest income people. But if you're at 60% of the state median income, you don't get the benefits from it. If you're in an apartment building with more than 4 units, you don't get the benefits from it. There's massive gaps in that spending, and they're still spending $1 billion a year. So we're worried that we're going to see that again. We saw the exact same thing with the regional greenhouse gas initiative.
Yeah, I think that speaks to an important point, that if you don't have equity built into the design of the programs, it's probably not going to come out organically from it. So the need to actually be intentional about that when designing policy.
Yeah, like one way that we describe environmental justice communities is that these are communities that are like historically underinvested in.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that it's not a one-to-one, If you just do this on a population basis, then you're not actually changing the gap. You're just shifting everyone up a little, which is better than nothing, So Massachusetts legislature, if you're listening, spend the money, please. But it's like, it's not going to catch up. And that's the real issue, is you're talking about decades of underinvestment. And, I don't want to blame Massachusetts alone. The federal government has done a really great job of not caring about people. And we're seeing that right now too.
Yeah, no, on a cross issue areas, it's very clear. One thing that we were talking before that you had noted that you wanted to be able to bring up is that so as we were talking before about the connections between respiratory diseases, the current pandemic, as well as the need for clean air, and how that connects to climate change, World Asthma Day is coming up soon. And I know that Clean Water Action is participating in stuff around that, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we're helping host a World Asthma Day virtual town hall. Please excuse the virtual town hall if that's tired already. I can't keep track of quarantine culture. We've got other things going on as well. So we're going to do a virtual town hall. It's going to be on May 5th from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. We're going to have a number of speakers from all over the state. We're going to talk about multiple issues, including what people are struggling with. I think there's a lot of issues right now that people are having that are health related, and a lot that are economic. And I don't like to disentangle those. I think they're completely connected, and that's part of our message. And we're going to be talking about our historically underinvested in communities. And after our virtual town hall, where you're going to get to hear from a variety of people, we're going to have a little some sort of participatory discussion thing, so you can come and talk to organizers around the state working on these issues. So follow Clean Water Action on social media. I think you can follow the Green Justice Coalition. We're going to be putting out materials as soon as possible. And yeah, join us on May 5th.
So if people did want to follow Clean Water Action, let's say on Twitter, or go to the website, what would it be?
Sure. If you type in Clean Water Action Massachusetts, we'll pop up.
Okay.
On Twitter, I think it's clean H2OMA.
Okay. And
Something like
what is the Clean Water Action Massachusetts website?
Yeah, so we're just at cleanwater.org, and
Okay.
then you can click over to Massachusetts. We work on federal and local issues, so I think it's actually really good right now to get a little update on what Trump is doing during all of this, which is loosening environmental regulations,
Yeah, there
basically
was a Mercury
erasing
issue
them.
in Mercury recently, right?
Um, I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to verify that without checking.
No
But yeah,
problem.
it's a whole host of issues. I think mercury is one of the main ones under the Clean Water Act that we've been paying attention to.
Yeah. And so like as we wrap up, I want to see like what would for somebody watching now, watching later, should be watching and isn't, what would your like main takeaways be for what you want people to kind of leave this thinking about or taking action with?
Yeah. So I have a couple things. The first one is, if you're a climate activist, care about every issue. So we're not going to solve climate by not talking about housing justice or immigration or education. Honestly, even when they don't seem connected, they all are very connected. They all come, it all has to come from a place about putting people first. And that's kind of like, I think one of the biggest things that we've seen in Massachusetts. We have a lot of solidarity between different movements, and like climate has showed up for housing, and immigration and disability rights advocates have showed up for climate. We all understand that it's connected. And I would just say, like, if you're supporting the cause, support the other causes too. Like, they all matter, and we need to think about how we can create a politics and a society that cares more for people. So that's number one. Number two is look at what's close to you. So if you live close to a big city, see if there's a frontline community there. If you don't, maybe connect with environmental grassroots organization. Almost every grassroots organization is in Mass Power Forward. That's John, I know you're associated with Sierra Club. We've got Mass Climate Action Network, UU Mass Action. There's all sorts of big groups in it, 350 Mass. All of the grassroots environmental groups are in Mass Power Forward. I would say get involved through there.
And if people want to learn more about Mass Power Forward, where should they go?
Yeah, you could look up our website, mapowerforward.org. So mapowerforward.org, or you can go to our Facebook, Mass Power Forward. I would encourage you, like, get in touch with one of those organizations. Look for frontline communities to support. A lot of our frontline partners, they honestly would not have been able to do this call with us because they're so busy doing things like making sure people have childcare and food and the basic necessities that they need to live. So I think it's really important right now that if you're in a place that has resources, direct them towards the places that need it most. Because right now there is some federal help, and it ignored large swaths of the population. People that are underbanked, people that are undocumented or aren't citizens, people who are working like some of the lowest wage jobs. They're in a really hard position right now.
It's a great kind of final point to land on about both kind of the interconnectedness of so many issues. Or just thinking about like that in order to, let's say, go to let's say community meeting about the siting of a project, that connects to somebody's job, kind of has access to childcare, the kind of housing stability and all of those, and how all of those issues ultimately do come together and the need for action. So Vick, I want to thank you again so much for joining this evening. I'll say happy Earth Day to you. For this 50-year-old environmental holiday, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in or will tune in later.
Great, thank you so much.